Good day. Welcome to listen to a lecture on biodiversity. I am Ilkka Hanski. I'm a professor of ecology in the University of Helsinki, where we do much research on the ecological and evolutionary processes that shape biodiversity both locally and globally. I have written a book about biodiversity, which will be published by the University of Chicago Press. In this lecture, I have highlighted some of the topics covered in the book, from invasions of species to evolution of species and to the role of habitat loss and fragmentation in causing species extinctions and loss of biodiversity. I have prepared this lecture and the book for all of you who are interested in nature and biodiversity and about the ecological and evolutionary foundations of biodiversity. So what is biodiversity? In broad terms, biodiversity includes all the features of life, from the genetic variation in the millions of species that inhabit the Earth to the occurrence of major biomes and ecosystems in the world. In practice, when we talk about biodiversity, we usually talk about species diversity and habitat diversity. Now, to be able to talk about species, we need good descriptions of species so that everybody knows that we talk about the same species with a particular name. Starting from the 18th century, biologists have described the life on Earth, the species with which we share the planet. Since the Swedish naturalist Carl von Linné invented his system of classifying organisms, this has been the way of describing species into species, genera, families, and higher categories. Knowledge of birds and mammals accumulated rapidly, and by the early 19th century, most species of birds were well known, especially in Europe and North America. The famous American naturalist and painter John James Audubon could paint most of the birds in North America in the 1830s. The paintings of birds in his main work, The Birds of America, are truly marvelous. Only relatively few species have been discovered, only few species of birds have been discovered since Audubon's time, since 1830s or 40s. Sadly, during this same period of time, several species have gone extinct, have gone globally extinct. Thus, the famous passenger pigeon, which used to be perhaps the commonest bird on the Earth, went extinct in the early 20th century. The Carolina parakeet also went extinct, although it was very common in the early 19th century, so common that farmers complain about the large numbers that caused damage to their crops. Yet another bird species that has gone extinct in North America is the ivory-billed woodpecker, one of the largest species of woodpeckers. In the case of all these species, the main cause of their extinction has been deforestation, destruction of forest, and particularly old-growth forest, as well as hunting in the case of the passenger pigeon and the Carolina parakeet. For most other groups of animals and plants, knowledge about species diversity has accumulated much more gradually. In Finland, at the same time when John James Audubon painted his birds in North America, Wilhelm von Wright painted both birds and all the species of moths and butterflies that were known at his time in Sweden and Finland. But this is only a small fraction of butterflies and moths, because since 1830, large numbers of new species have been found and discovered and found and described. Curiously, both Audubon and von Wright wanted to paint birds and moths in their real size. This caused some problem because the largest species of birds are so large that they couldn't fit into one plate, and hence Audubon had to paint their necks bent. While von Wright had the opposite problem. Smaller species of moths are so small that they only covered a small part of the plate, and hence in his volume many of the pages appear quite empty. So our knowledge of birds and mammals is by now nearly complete. We know that there are just over 10,000 species of birds and a bit more than 5,000 of species of mammals on Earth. Concerning the major groups of animals and plants, there are about 60,000 species of vertebrates. There are more than 1 million species of invertebrates, which are mostly insects, which have been described. More than 300,000 species of plants, more than 20,000 species of mushrooms, and so on. Altogether, scientists have so far described about 1.5 million species. But this is not the true number. Using various methods, it has been estimated that the likely real number of species on Earth is from 5 to 7 million species. So most species are actually insects and flowering plants, and especially in the case of insects, only perhaps 20–30% of the true number of insects have been described so far. The evolution of insects and flowering plants started some 300 million years ago, after which their diversity has steadily increased. This increase in species diversity is at least partly due to their interactions. Insects pollinate plants, other insects are herbivorous, they feed on plants, and plants in their turn, they have produced structures like flowers to attract pollinators, and they produce chemical compounds that deter herbivores, the insects which are feeding on plants. These interactions have produced co-evolutionary dynamics where one group of species affects the evolution of the other group of species and vice versa. Because of this co-evolution, greater is the current species diversity, more opportunities there are for more species to evolve. So in this case, diversity begets diversity. More diversity increases diversity. Most species and most of biodiversity occur in the tropics. Scientists have defined what are called the biodiversity hotspots, which are oftentimes relatively small areas where the numbers of species are particularly high and where there are very many endemic species. These are species which occur nowhere else. And also by definition, the biodiversity hotspots they have much of their original native vegetation destroyed, and therefore the species which occur there are threatened. I have studied with my students dung beetles in Madagascar, the ecology and evolution of dung beetles. There are about 300 species, more than 95% of them are endemic. So Madagascar is one of the very hottest biodiversity hotspots anywhere. During our study, during the past 10 years, we have discovered some 30–40 new species of dung beetles, which is typical for insect studies in the tropics. A large number of species still remains to be discovered and described. At the same time, we have become aware that a large number of species might already be extinct. There are some 20–30 species in old museum collections which we have not discovered, and nobody has seen them in nature for the past 50 years. So either they are already extinct or they are effectively extinct, meaning that there are only some small remnant populations which might be very difficult to find. Now the reason for such a large number of species already having gone extinct is deforestation. Madagascar has only about 10% of the original forest vegetation left. Also for dung beetles, what matters are the populations of mammals, in the case of Madagascar particularly lemurs, which produce the resource for dung beetles. Sadly, there is much hunting and poaching, even in the protected areas. In general, researchers describe about 15,000 to 20,000 new species per year. So this is the rate of scientists describing biodiversity. At the same time, we estimate that about 5,000 species go extinct in each year. This means that scientists have no opportunity to describe all the species before some of them have already gone extinct. We estimate that about 1 to 10% of all existing species will go extinct in the next 100 years. Compared with the background rate, which is the rate of extinctions before any human influence on Earth, let's say about 50,000 years ago. Now, during the past 500 million years, there have been 5 periods when the rate of species extinctions has been much elevated. These are the periods of mass extinction. The causes of the mass extinction periods are varied, and we don't know the exact causes of many of them. Oftentimes volcanic activity has been involved. The exception is the 5th mass extinction, which occurred about 66 million years ago, when a huge 10-kilometer radius meteorite or asteroid collided with Earth in the Yucatan Peninsula in the present-day Mexico. The amount of energy that was released in this collision has been calculated to have been about the same as if 10 billion Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs would have been detonated at the same time. So we understand that the energy was enormous. Not surprising, the consequences were also enormous. There must have been long-lasting changes in climate, in ecosystems. Large numbers of species went extinct, including all the dinosaurs. Because of the current 6th mass extinction, which we are now living, is also well known. The cause is the impact of one single species, our own species, on Earth. Perhaps the best way to illustrate our impact on Earth is to consider the biomass of all the large-bodied mammals, the megafauna, and the biomass of humans in the past and at present. 50,000 years ago, the total biomass of megafauna, which is mammals larger than 44 kilograms in body mass, was about 250 teragrams, which is 1,000 million kilograms. The human biomass at that time was very little. At present, the total biomass of remaining megafauna is only about 50 teragrams, whereas the human population has the biomass of 500 teragrams, which is twice the biomass of all the megafauna 50,000 years ago, and much, much greater than the current megafauna, which is 50 teragrams. We need to add here the total biomass of domestic mammals, which is 1,000 teragrams. So in combination, the human biomass and the biomass of the domestic mammals is 1,500 teragrams compared with only 50 teragrams for all the other large-bodied mammals. I think these figures, they illustrate very clearly the enormous impact of our species on Earth. One of the mechanisms which influences biodiversity is the movement of species. This is, of course, a natural phenomenon. It has happened all the time. But our human land use, our transport has made it easier for species to move from one place to another. We move species either intentionally or unintentionally. Therefore, the world is full of new invading species in places where they used not to occur. In chapter 4 of my book, I tell about a little research project which I did in La Gomera in the Canary Islands back in 1976. I knew that there are some tropical invading blowfly species. These are flies whose larvae feed on carcasses. I was curious to find out whether the invading species would have any impact on the native species. In fact, I found one more new invading species during my own trip. In the genus Calliphora, there are 3 species. There are 2 common species in the Canary Islands which occur everywhere in all kinds of habitats. Calliphora vicina and Calliphora vomitoria, which are also common species in Europe and North America. And in fact, in many other places in the world, they really are good invaders. And then there is a 3rd species which is very special. I was really happy to find it, Calliphora splendens, which occurs only in the special forest type in the Canary Islands. This is called the laurel forest. It's an ancient subtropical forest type which occurs in climates where the temperature is mild and humidity is relatively high. So Calliphora splendens is very different from the others. Nobody has done any molecular studies to find out exactly how old this species might be, but my guess is that the ancestor may have invaded the Canary Islands 1 million years ago. It probably was like the other species to start with, a good invader. The ancestor occurred in many different habitat types. But in the course of time, the flies encountered this laurel forest, which at that time covered most of the Canary Islands, and because of natural selection favoring those flies that did best under the conditions which were common on the islands, the fly gradually became better and better adapted to the laurel forest conditions. The other species, once again, we don't know exactly when they have arrived, but because they look very similar to the species from Europe and North America, my guess is that they have arrived rather recently. So they still are generalist species, occur in many different habitat types, including human-modified habitats and such. Now, this is a common story about invasive species. The invaders themselves mostly are habitat generalist and also generalist in terms of other ecological requirements. They do well in man-modified environments and so. In the course of time, the species become gradually evolved into the conditions which prevail in the new area, and therefore they often become more specialized, like Calliphora splendens became a specialist living only in the laurel forest. Now, this was good at the time, but when conditions change in a changing world, specialization may become a problem, a handicap. And it has become a handicap for Calliphora splendens and the other species which are laurel forest specialists, because the area of laurel forest has become greatly reduced, and now these species they have become endangered because of loss of their habitat. The same thing has happened to innumerable other species which, following their invasions, they have become specialists in the new area. Specialist species, they are much more vulnerable to go extinct in changing world, in changing environmental conditions, whereas the generalist species, which are the good invaders, they prevail. La Gomera, where I sampled blowflies in 1976, is famous in history because it was there that Christopher Columbus left for his first voyage across Atlantic to North America. He arrived in the Caribbean, and we shall also next move to the island of Puerto Rico in the Caribbean. Just like in La Gomera and the other islands in the Canaries, Puerto Rico has lost most of its native vegetation. Now, ecologists have estimated the relationship between the number of species within a particular area and the amount of habitat in that area by what is called the species area relationship. In this graph, we see one of the first species area relationships which was constructed for plants on the British Islands. On the horizontal axis, we have the area of a particular part of the Great Britain, and on the vertical axis, we see the number of species within that area. When we take a logarithmic transformation of both axes, we see a straight line relationship between the two axes. The slope of this relationship tells us how fast the species number increases when the area increases. Now, in the case of Puerto Rico, assuming a slope of 0.25, which is typical for islands, we can predict that if about 10% of the habitat is remaining, then about half of the species will remain. Now, this prediction has caused some controversy. The Danish scientist Bjørn Lomborg has challenged the prediction, and he has written, "The largest tropical study of the correlation between rainforest and the extinction of species was carried out in Puerto Rico by Ariel Lugo of the United States Department of Agriculture. He found that the primary forest had been reduced by 99% over a period of 400 years. Only 7 out of the 60 species of birds had become extinct, although the island today is home to 97 species of birds. This indicates a serious problem with Wilson's rule of thumb. And what is perhaps more astonishing is that even though the area of primary forest on Puerto Rico was reduced by 99%, they ended up with more species of birds." Now, the problem with Lomborg's argument is that he pays no attention to the ecology of the species. There are indeed about 100 species of birds that have been found in Puerto Rico, but many of them have nothing to do with the forest. There are many invading species, like in the Canary Islands, species which have been transported by humans. There are species which are native, but which don't occur in forest. In fact, there are only about 20 species which have evolved to be forest living. Now, there are 7 species of birds which have gone extinct, and there is an additional 4 species which are nearly extinct. The population sizes are small, and they persist only because of intensive conservation measures. So 7 plus 4 is 11 species out of 20 species have gone extinct, which is roughly half of the species have gone extinct, which is very consistent with the prediction from the species area relationship. So the species area relationship can be used as a rough baseline prediction for the number of species that occur within a certain area of habitat. And it can also be used to roughly estimate the number of species that will go extinct when the area of habitat is reduced. There are, however, other factors that need to be taken into account. For instance, if the destruction of habitat is recent, then not all the species have had time to respond to that environmental change, and they still exist, even though after a longer period of time they would go extinct. So in this case, the species area relationship gives an overestimation of extinctions. But once again, the species area relationship gives the prediction for a kind of steady state situation when the species have had enough time to respond. Another factor that is not included in the species area relationship is habitat fragmentation. And the question is whether fragmentation of the remaining habitat makes an additional impact on the number of persisting species in addition to the total area of habitat. To address this question, we move further south. The forests in the Atlantic forest region in Brazil are highly fragmented. The forest now occurs in 250,000 patches or fragments, and more than half of them are less than 50 hectares in area. Brazilian ecologist Renata Bardini with her students has studied the influence of forest loss and fragmentation on the occurrence of small mammal species living in forests. She has taken advantage of the variation in the degree of variation in the amount and degree of fragmentation of forest in different landscapes. So they have studied different forest landscapes, landscapes where 10% of the forest is remaining and where the forest is highly fragmented. In another landscape, 30% of the total amount of forest is remaining and the forest is somewhat less fragmented. And there's a landscape with 50% of forest remaining, even less fragmented. The reference point is intact forest landscape where 100% of the forest is still remaining. The study subjects are small mammal species which occur only in forests, so they hardly ever go outside the forest, and therefore it is difficult for these species to move from one forest fragment to another. Here is the result of their findings. We can see that there are species which are common in all the forest landscapes. On the vertical axis, we have the number of study plots within each landscape which have been occupied by the species, where the species have been found. Some species, they have been found in practically all the study plots which have been studied. Whereas some other species, they are uncommon, they only occur in a small fraction of the study plots. When we go from the intact forest to forest landscape with 50% of forest remaining, we see that the pattern of species commonness is about the same, and yet in the landscape with 30% of forest remaining, still there are common species, there are uncommon species, the pattern is still about the same. But when we move to a forest landscape with 10% of forest only remaining, only one single species was found in that landscape. All the other species which were still present in the landscape with 30% of forest remaining, they have now disappeared. So somewhere between the landscapes with 10% forest remaining and 30% forest remaining, there is a critical threshold, which when you go below that threshold point, the species don't persist in the landscape any longer. We talk about extinction threshold. So for many of these species of small mammals, there is an extinction threshold which is somewhere between 10% and 30% of forest remaining. Now, one question which still remains is the influence of habitat fragmentation. In this case, like in many other cases, there is a close correlation between the amount of forest remaining in the landscape and the degree of fragmentation. And therefore, it is rather difficult to tell apart their possible independent effects. To say something more conclusive about the effect of fragmentation, one possibility is to use models. And this is what I have done with my colleague Joel Rybicki. We have constructed a model where we can change the degree of fragmentation in relation to the amount of forest in the landscape. So we have different kinds of landscapes, and in this particular example we have two landscapes where the total amount of forest across the landscape is the same, but the degree of fragmentation is different. In one case the forest occurs in large fragments, in the other case the forest occurs in many small fragments, but the total amount is the same. And so what is the result? The result of this exercise is shown here. On the horizontal axis we have the total amount of forest in the landscape. On the vertical axis we have the number of species out of several hundred species which persist in the landscape. We see a clear effect of the total amount of forest. The different lines, however, they show different landscapes with different degree of fragmentation. The total amount of forest has been split into a different number of fragments. And we see that higher is the degree of fragmentation, smaller is the number of species. So if you look at landscapes with only 5% of area having the appropriate landscape, we see that there are still very many species present in the landscape if the landscape is not fragmented, if the habitat occurs in 1, 2 or 4 large fragments, but the number of species drops to nothing if that same amount of habitat has been fragmented into a large number of small fragments. So we can see that both total area of habitat and the degree of fragmentation, they matter. And the degree of fragmentation, it particularly makes a difference when the total amount of habitat across the landscape is small. One problem with modeling studies is that no model can capture everything in reality. This is not even the purpose of models. They would become too complex if you try to include too many details. Another approach to studying complex issues like habitat fragmentation is to select a model system, which is an empirical study system which has been selected for the very purpose of studying the particular question. Now, in my book I describe how I selected back in 1991 the Glanville-Fritillary study metapopulation in the Åland Islands as a model system to study the consequences of habitat fragmentation. The Åland Island has a huge network of 4,000 dry small meadows, which makes it very appropriate for studying fragmentation, particularly because different parts of the study area have more or less fragmented habitat. So we have studied with this butterfly, we have studied the ecological, genetic and evolutionary consequences of fragmentation. We have worked out the details in terms of ecological mechanisms of the extinction threshold, the critical point with decreasing amount of habitat and increasing fragmentation, where the species, where the population or metapopulation lose survival. We have shown that inbreeding depression is an important mechanism which increases the rate of extinction of local population and has also consequences for the dynamics of the entire metapopulation. And we have studied the evolutionary changes that occur in butterflies when they encounter increasingly fragmented habitat. This may, and indeed in the case of Glanville-Fritillary, it has affected the movement rate of the butterflies, which is a critical feature of their life cycle in a fragmented landscape. So far, habitat loss and fragmentation, they have been the main cause of species extinction and loss of biodiversity. We saw that the Calliphora splendens fly in the Canary Islands in La Gomera, its distribution has been reduced because of loss of its habitat, the laurel forest. And there are innumerable cases of species which have been specialized to a particular habitat having become less and less common because of loss of their habitat. And some species have got extinct by this process. Another mechanism which has become increasingly important in recent years and decades is climate warming. Many species have shifted their latitudinal distributions towards higher latitudes, and they have shifted their distribution on mountains towards higher elevations because of climate warming, when the species populations have tried to track the suitable environmental conditions for them. Now, I have one good example of this from Sarawak, Borneo, one other biodiversity hotspot. I traveled to Sarawak as a young student in 1978 to study dung beetles along different forest types, and I also did a long trapping transect up to the summit of the Gunung Mulu mountain at the elevation of 2,300 meters. Now, 2013, I went back there with a group of my students. We did exactly the same trapping, exactly the same transect. And here is what we observed for a group of 4 dung beetles which occur at different elevations. The lowland species we did not find at all in 2013, perhaps because of chance. It was an uncommon species already in 1978. But if you look at the distributions of the 3 other Okicanton species, you see that both the lower elevational limits and the upper elevational limits of these 3 species, they have shifted uphill about 100 meters. So their distributions have shifted up, and this amount of movement, as it were, along the elevation is more or less what you would expect from climate warming, because the climatic conditions, they have also shifted uphill, and the species have, in this case, they have moved with the changing environmental conditions. Now in this case, the species still find suitable habitat for them, but you can imagine that if you have species which occur on smaller mountains or already occur towards the peak of the mountain, at some point all the habitat for them disappears because there is nowhere to go if you have reached already the summit. And it has been predicted that because of this process, species will go extinct, particularly on mountain ranges with time when climate becomes increasingly warm. The last chapter in the book is about biodiversity and ecosystem stability and productivity, also including the various benefits that we humans obtain from biodiversity. The starting point for this chapter is Greenland, the largest island in the world. My former student Olivier Kilk used to work there on the population dynamics of the collared lemming and its predators. I visited Olivier in the field in 1996. At this point, the lemming populations were at the low level. I saw only few lemmings. The lemming dynamics are greatly influenced by predation by 4 species of predators: the snowy owl, the Arctic fox, long-tailed skua, and the stoat. They all breed well only when the lemming numbers are high, but they suppress the lemming numbers to a low level, at which point they have various tactics to cope with this situation. Very complex dynamics among the 5 species. The outcome, however, is a simple 4-year population cycle, very regular population cycle, which was observed in Greenland up to the year 2000, and it has been observed also in many other Arctic localities. Now, after the year 2000, the situation has changed dramatically, as you can see from this graph. There is no sign of regular population cycle any longer. The numbers of lemmings have remained at the low level with only little fluctuation. Now the question here is why? We have used mathematical models to try to understand the reasons for this dramatic change in the dynamics. And we have come to the conclusion that the main mechanism most likely is climate warming, which has influenced the lemming life history and has influenced the interaction between the lemming and its predators. The summer period has become significantly longer in Greenland, and there are other significant climatic changes, environmental changes, which influence the lemming numbers. As we know, the climate warming has been particularly rapid in the Arctic region, and here we have a demonstration of the likely consequences of warming climate on the key species in the Arctic, the collared lemming and its predators. A very dramatic shift in the population dynamics. I finish my lecture by asking you what might be the biodiversity that is closest to your own mind and body. Now, as I possibly can't hear your answer, I offer some possible answers. Some of you might say that large animals, they are the most important ones. And there are good reasons to consider that the large-bodied species, the remaining megafauna that we still have on Earth, is really important. It is important for ecosystem functioning because the large animals, they have disproportional effect on other species in the communities in which they live. And they are charismatic species which most likely influence the positive attitude towards other species by most people. Now others might say that insects are most important simply because there are so many of them. In fact, most species are insects. And of course, many insects are enormously important. If you consider pollinators, they are important. Without pollinating insects, the agricultural industry would not be really possible, and the crop productivity would decline rapidly. Well, perhaps the question which species are most important is a bit silly to start with. I think it's not really possible nor meaningful to try to value different species in terms of their importance to us. All species have their function in the communities and ecosystem, and under some conditions they may influence the dynamics of the communities in an important way. Now, I asked the question because I wanted to draw your attention to one component of biodiversity which we usually don't think about. And this is the diversity of microbes that inhabits our own bodies. Microbes which occur in our gut, our respiratory tract, under our skin. Now, this biodiversity has actually evolved with our own species over millions of years. And therefore, many our bodily functions, they really would not operate normally without the microbial friends, as it were. So we get a part of this microbial biodiversity in our bodies already at birth. But as the graph here shows, over the years, from the birth up to the age of 8 years, the microbial diversity, in this case diversity in the skin, increases significantly. So where do we get these extra microbes in our body? We do get through our interactions with our environment. Now, depending on the kind of environment with which we are in interaction, we get different kinds of microbes, and the microbial community becomes more or less diverse in terms of different types of species. Now, recent studies demonstrate, and I describe this in my book under the biodiversity hypothesis, that interaction with more natural environments is beneficial for us in terms of us obtaining, kind of accumulating in our body beneficial microbes which boost our health and well-being, particularly in the case of chronic inflammatory diseases, which our immune system is fighting against, and here the microbial influence is really important. So without the microbes, we would be much more vulnerable to these diseases, which include allergies, asthma, but also obesity has been shown to be one of the conditions which is influenced even some types of cancer and even some types of depression in this category of diseases. So we have in our own body, we have a layer of biodiversity, the microbes, which is absolutely essential for our health and well-being. This layer of biodiversity is interacting with the environmental biodiversity, which is kind of second layer of biodiversity surrounding us. We need to have both of these layers of biodiversity for our own health and well-being. And therefore, it is critically important to preserve, to conserve also the outer layer, the environmental biodiversity, which enriches the first layer, the microbial biodiversity in our own body. With these thoughts, I finish my lecture and say goodbye.